Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. You can check out our upcoming events and full schedule at wab.org. We're so happy to have Dante Micheaux with us this afternoon. First, we'll hear Dante read, then he'll be in conversation with the poet Celeste Schantz. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dante's book Circus is available through our bookstore Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Dante is also leading a workshop on the lyric self next Saturday. I'll provide that link as well. Dante Micheaux is the author of Amorous Shepherd and Circus, which won the Four Quartets Prize from the Poetry Society of America and the T.S. Eliot Foundation. His poems and translations have appeared in African American Review, the American Poetry Review, Callaloo, Literary Imagination, Poem a Day, Poetry, PN Review, and Tongue, among other journals and anthologies. Micheaux's other honors include the 2020 Ambit Magazine Poetry Prize and fellowships from the Canem Foundation and the New York Times Foundation. As the poet Terrance Hayes has said about Circus, Dante Micheaux's superb poetic aptitude is wedded to an equally superb poetic amplitude. Intimate soliloquy, lyric address, and linguistic allegory merge with resonating voices and personae. This poem is masterful, paradoxical, and spiritual. Dante, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to all who have joined with us this afternoon. I can't see you, so I hope you can all hear me. Usually when I am invited to read, or I guess the benefit of being invited to read and feature when you're not sharing the platform with other poets is I get to begin my readings with a poem by another poet. And in this case, I'm going to begin with a poem by the poet Lorenzo Thomas, who was a Pan-American poet who I knew many years ago. The poem is called Salt, and it's from a book of his that was published in 1979 called Chances Are Few. Salt, after Ovidio Martins. I was born a speck of sand, thus I engulf the oceans, all the oceans in the world. My couriers are waves who fetch and tote my messages and secrets. My missives and epistles, little nostalgic notes, are high-priced, briny sighs collected by the sirens at the cresting of the tides. Within the swirls and jeweled shells of all oceans in the world dwell echoing confirmation of my love songs. I was born a speck of sand, so I engulf the oceans, all the oceans in the world. Lorenzo Thomas. I wanted to read that poem by Lorenzo because he was really a marvelous poet, and I'm not sure that many people read his work during his lifetime or indeed are reading it now. And it's fitting that that particular book has an epigraph by Derek Walcott. Today is Derek Walcott's birthday, or would have been his 91st birthday. And so I just wanted to sort of bring the two of them into the reading with me. The first poem that I'm going to read is called Slaughter of the Geese. It's the favorite winter poem of mine, and I imagine that a lot of you are joining us from upstate New York, where I imagine it is at least cold, if not snow on the ground. And I desperately miss living in a climate where there are 4 definitive seasons, and I miss snow a great deal. I don't think it snowed here in London really, maybe in 8 years or so. Anyway, this poem comes out of one of my earliest winters here, Slaughter of the Geese. With the scrim of green and crimson leaves lost to winter, the bottom of the garden was conspicuous, bare, save a wild gaggle, unable to shake the frost from wing, their panic palpable as one fox after another slipped from concealed den and began to circle. Watching, a spectator of the mesmerizing violence, this was no tragedy. The foxes were meager, they were starving, and accounts of their hunger-driven malice spread, startling pedestrians at night, haunting sleepers with ghostly wail, nibbling on babies in broad daylight. So when the first fox mustered all its strength in attack, and the rest turned to quell the honking by lunging at the necks of the flailing geese, when teeth and muzzle breached anserine flesh and the blood began to flow, I left that dream and was glad. This next poem is called Miscarriage. A son is not easy to make, less so when you have no money or space in the body to nurture him. So when I see mine playing in the road with schoolmates, doing his best to compose himself in single file, without my name, because the other half wanted to be in the world as much as I did, and we couldn't agree. Before boarding the bus for his first field trip, I am lightheaded with his promise, the demands he made in infancy, a tendency for mismatched socks, the way he sings himself to sleep, his compassion, the interest in the world of his parents, which he will lose when he finds his own, and his inherent stubbornness, most welcome upheaval. What can I give him but the elation he gives me, as he follows the teacher's instructions like a good boy, like his father's son? But he is not my son. He is someone else's pride, and I am just a stranger watching a bunch of kids on my way to where I do not remember. And just like that, he's gone, my precious boy, gone before I ever had him. The next poem I'm going to read is about another child, my goddaughter, whose birthday is also today, and who I just got finished speaking to about an hour ago. She too is in upstate New York. The poem is called Theologies for Quora, and it's written in 5 sections. Theologies for Quora. 1, From Locust and Wild Honey. On a lesser diet than that of the wretched rests a prophecy. Some of us come to prepare. I stood before my God at a foreign altar and promised to guide you, me with my heretic theology. I practiced the ways passed to me by descendants of followers of a wild man, followers in the desert downwind of his musk, listening to him confess himself unfit to loose latches on shoes. They believed his words holy, ignored bits of insect wing in his beard, and then he told them of a dove that no one else could see. I have learned to retain my head while speaking truth. 2, Rite of the Baptism of Children. Do I reject the glamour of evil? I do. You are creation, the same afterward and after the Holy Spirit. Only now you see the door to life and unto the kingdom of God. Do not feel the need of any claimant to royal priesthood. Some ancient, calling himself Peter, must have been in his cups when he wrote that ish. The nerve. You were cleansed with water by power of the word. Sign of the cross, phooey. There is no miracle in an instrument of death. See Martin Luther, Theses 5, 16, 28, and 95. God made no symbols, people did, etc. 3, Some Thoughts on Caterina Benincasa. Not much older than you when she first saw the Christ, seated in glory with a few of his disciples, who gave her many gifts, a consummate marriage by way of his foreskin, the blessed stigmata, and her head as a bag of rose petals. To build a cell inside your mind, a cell of self-knowledge is good advice, my child. The Christ commanded her to open the eye of her intellect and gaze into him. This made her secularly gifted, a power broker. Read her correspondence, yes, the letters of a lunatic diplomat, but heeded, virtuous, sweet, amorous word of God. 4. Aphatharite. He sighed. All power in heaven and earth is. Be opened. Hear and speak the truth, but tell no one how. Superior to the purifications of old law was that water. Be opened, daughter. All power in heaven and earth is. No questions. Be opened. Hold fast to my teachings, not those of stewards, but my words. Seek you first, girl, the kingdom of my love with all your mind. All your mind. Do not forget your mind. You are mine. Be opened. Power. Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness. All power in heaven and earth is given me. Be opened. 5. Coda Patronalis. In the land of Mama, there is a cathedral, the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit. Inside is an icon, an image of Theotokos. Once old enough to go solo, after an age of discernment is reached, perhaps in passing by, go there. Make your way up the nave and to the right. There you will find her looking at you, babe in arm, tired and anemic as usual. Bless her with a kiss and make her holy. Bless the babe too, if feeling generous. Use a chair if needed. It is a painting. Simple miracles were made on a lesser diet than that of the wretched. And I guess to close out, even though it might seem a little early, I'm going to read from Circus. I'm going to skip around a bunch for those of you who have the book, but it's a long poem, so it might seem that I'm going on for a bit, but I'm going to skip from section to section. Circus. All months are cruel, ladies and gentlemen. The lilacs that last in the dooryard bloomed are dead, so come you here for pleasure, and we shall entertain. See us Negroes dance and sing, for you, dear audience, we will do most anything. Our jungle bunnies dance the cooch for nickel, dime, anytime. Big George can lift a heifer on his shoulder, sip a brew and shine your shoe, but barely breaks a sweat. Oh, and Trickster in the stands will borrow money, steal your wallets, and pay you back in advance. Dangling Daniel hangs from a noose, bug-eyed, but do not fear. For just $1 more, you can make him holler with the crack of a whip in your hand. Step right up, encourage the kids out back, there's a ninny parade. Come one, come all, tell your friends, this is the show that never ends. Chipped brownstone stoops cradle the detritus of life. She is one, lost in satiety, the bliss of oblivion, harlot of the dope in her veins. Behind her looms a hell rich with the darkness of forgetting, even in daylight, in view of children taught to steer clear but never do, curious about the freedom of barely clothed women who do not work and men with big cars whose pockets are lined with money, unlike their fathers who do exist, who conduct trains in the underworld, who they never see, who only see them when they are sleeping, who know what they know about the world but cannot protect them, who cannot rid their lives of women like her, seen on the street every day, on the way to school, on the way home, a face more familiar than their mother's, with a name they remember and include in rhyme. She's asked them for $1 before, in the bodega next door to the house on which stoop she sits, its particle board windows keeping her shame from the sight of passersby. Inside, she is the plaything of Satan's doppelgangers, the ball in a game of jacks, a hole in one, her breasts like dice, her body a crumpled lottery ticket arching toward a nice shot. Stumbling to the rhythm of no music, she laughs, drools, knowing that at the end of this dance, she will be offered the favor she desires most, the luster on her tongue, the calm of fantastic stupor, in a corner, on a corner, cornered. In such a state, she dreams of ridiculous wealth by a pool, in a fur coat, but wakes on a pile of dead rats, phlegmatic, too gone to go. She's hungry and can hear an ice cream truck outside, makes for the door, makes for the curb where the ice cream truck is, does not have $1. Woe unto you, illusion seekers. The milk from the breast of the benevolent stepmother is tainted with illusions. Refuse, hold your breath, brethren. Remember, en route to the land of milk and honey is the desert, and the milk is an illusion, and the honey is funny honey, acid honey, trip you out honey. The desert is where you want to be. Stay away from the water. Remember where the water brought you. Be rabid in the endless water. Swallow and die. The illusions make you dance, slide, dip, shake, boogaloo, shangalang, ain't no thing but a chain gang. Elude the illusions. The illusions want more and then some. The illusions want work with no sass and entertainment. Why you think you dancing? You on a party ride. It's shock therapy, which causes dehydration, which causes want of water. Why you think you dancing? Stay away from the water, to a worthless thing. The illusions are worthless, and you who follow illusion become worthless. How empty your worship in a God-made world with your handmade apocalypse and its denigrated singing. You have been given poisoned water to drink, and the thirst is an illusion, makes you dance. The spectators are impatient for popcorn, for its salt, for your weight in salt, as they watch the show that never ends and become thirsty and drink the water and become corrupted by their own illusions. Heed, dancers and singers in the machine. Stop and listen to the noise subside. And don't be surprised that you made the noise or that the spectators are quiet, gone mute long ago. You crush the heart and shake the bones of your prophets and do not hear, become a menace to your enemies. Cease praying to the gone. You have the proof. You are the proof. Why you think you dancing? Can't you feel it? 1-2 step. The exhaustion, 1-2 step. They love it when you 1-2 step. Why do you think you're dancing? The weaker, the more you feel it. The slipshod guilt of a gyrating stripper, blind to redemption, a clutch of dollar bills in hand. There is remedy, a dose to pry you free from sanity, the marvelous trick of illusion. Stop dancing. Stop singing. Hoard the giving it up treasure. You have forsaken your house and abandoned your heritage and given up your heart to its enemies. Your eyes are false, diluted. Your colors fade. You have become fat mimicries, slaves to the audience, a party all the time madness, bloated beyond belief. Flee the big top. Come into the sun and be still. Baptize in the light. Be still. Sweat. Let it seep out you or have it beat out you. Kill the honky's monkey, or eternity awaits you in the disco inferno. You are weary from holding it in. Take off your clothes, run naked. Let it all hang loose if you're feeling afflicted. These lords love a sinner. Shake what your master gave you. Shake it loose. Wrest yourselves from it. It's not yours. It never was. Just part of the contract. Part of the deed became your creed. You have the proof. You are the proof. Cease praying to the gone. Become a menace to your enemies. Stop the show, for none will bemoan you, your yoke tossed off and sinking in time, no buoy for those giddy and drowning in the water. Stay away from the water. Remember where the water brought you. Swallow and die. The hour has already scattered here in the unreal city. Heed, dancers and singers in the machine. You are its industry. Crumble. Flee the big top. Down by the river under which I was put, by my own accord, I asked in prayer, in my silent time, in fear I asked. The book read, after the water, there is only life. So when I was bad, when it was a secret, when I knew it was no mistake, when I saw the blood moon and crawled under the bed, away from the avenging angels, away from the blast of the horn. Before the earth shook and closed my eyes, I asked for the water, asked to be taken, to be put under, so far under death, under sin, under the world of nights, asked for the water and not the shadow dance of the men behind the shades. After the water was light. After the light, there was clarity in waves. After clarity, death remained and decision. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much, Dante.
You're very welcome.
That was fantastic. I'm really in awe of your endings. Your final lines are each one is just, I'm sitting here going, so thank you very much for that. What a pleasure. I think what we're going to do now that we've had that wonderful reading is I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you, and then we can certainly also open it up to some questions from our viewers. So in that vein, I actually have two questions which sort of piggyback off of each other, and they're about your language. I've been really enjoying Marvelous Circus, and I recommend highly that everybody get a copy of this through Ampersand. And it's really just a fantastic poem divided into several sections. In reading your work, one encounters a speaker with 1,000 faces, I would say. And I was curious to know what your influences are. I know in the notes at the back of the book, for example, you mentioned Ralph Ellison, tales, odes, panoramic works containing the human condition, all different traditions and languages. The first part somehow, for me, called into mind a Homeric ode, a little bit of the prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Dante's Inferno, and perhaps the paraphrasing of Walt Whitman's The Lilacs That Last Bloomed in the Doorway, T.S. Eliot, April is the Cruelest Month. There's a bow to that. So can you speak a little bit about the code switching within your work between different traditions and languages?
Well, I think in the poem Circus, there isn't one speaker. By my own count, I think there are probably 15 speakers, of which I'm just one. As far as my influences are concerned, I have a lot of influences in the notes, which I would say aren't really notes. They are just another canto in the poem, really. I refer to Ralph Ellison Jr. Ralph Ellison Jr. is an alias or a heteronym for another poet, or he doesn't exist at all. He's certainly not related to the great writer Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison, as we all know, didn't have any children, though he really wanted them. And as far as Homer, I guess you mean Homeric hymn. I don't know if the poem contains much in regards to an influence of Homer besides the dedication. And perhaps the dedication is to alert the reader to prepare itself, to hear a story or a series of stories. But that certainly was not a conscious intention. But I've read Homer since I was a teenager, and I don't think anyone can get away from the sheer storytelling power in Homer. So if Circus contains credible storytelling, then that's a success, I think.
And I think that's what I was referring to is more in the sense of epic proportion.
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than specifically Homer.
Sure. I'd love to talk a long time about Homer and the difference between Homer's epic and Homer's, I think what you're referring to when you say Homeric ode are the hymns by Homer, which are written in the same meter, but are different in that aspect. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, you mentioned Eliot and Chaucer. I think there's a certain reader who might be bound by a Eurocentric reading experience who will read the opening line of Circus and they will hear Eliot and then and thereby Chaucer, and that will set the tone for their reading of the rest of the poem. They'll feel comfortable, and they'll think they know where they are. But that's a trap. That is an intentional trap. Eliot is only indirectly in this poem. A more widely read reader, I think, might see past that trap and see a poet taking on Melvin Tolson's baton and running with it. I think in this particular instance, it's curious that you read the moving in between those spaces as code switching rather than literary allusion, but I understand because there's so many different voices speaking in the poem that it can seem very much like there's this switching of voices, but again, I would just say that there are lots of different there are lots of different voices in the poem. Ultimately, all of the voices are mine, but they are characters. They spoke to me before I did anything before I said any words to a page.
Right. Yeah. It sort of leads into the other part of the language question. I was just noticing, patois, pidgin, dialect. For example, there's a section in Circus that deals with a character who sounds as though she's trying to lure children upstairs, and or young men. And which has a very different tone than the prior parts.
Yeah, I think the use of not only the use of different languages, but the use of different linguistic modes within a language, like dialect, like patois, like slang. I think when I was first composing Circus, it came out of a comment by an older white woman who said, in referencing a group of Black poets, that none of them spoke any foreign languages. Maybe one of them spoke Swahili, but that was probably about it. Now, she was saying this comment to me, a Black poet who I speak 3 languages. And so it was a dazzling display of ignorance. And I guess at the time, certainly the first canto of Circus was being composed at the time that conversation had happened. And that may have made its way into the tone of the poem. Yeah, but I think that is there's a lot of talk about code switching. My own ability to code switch, or the ability of the poem to code switch. And I think it is, it's one of those wonderful symptoms of enslavement. Being the descendant of people who were enslaved, it was a serious trauma, and there are some positive symptoms that come out of that trauma as much as there are the many negative symptoms that come from that trauma. And code switching, I think, is one of the positive symptoms of being stripped from your home and your culture and your language, and being in a place where you are forced to adapt quickly, and then having to strategize within those adaptations. And so I think code switching is as much a part of Black poetics as literary allusion is to, I would say, European poetics.
Understood. The thing that immediately comes to mind when you say that is the Gullah Geechee community in the South. Let me lead into another question. Allison Myers had asked one that sort of is actually, Allison, a question I was interested in asking too. Allison says, in writing Circus, were you influenced or inspired by long poems by American poets, Williams, Ginsberg, Olson, Pound, Carson, or others? I did notice in an interview that you did with the Poetry Society of America, actually I have a quote here, you said, American poetry is fresh. It breathes deep, sustaining breaths. This may seem an intangible literary quality, but in my reading of poetries from other traditions or in other languages, the same motivation is rarely there. When I do discover that quality in another poetry, the evidence of American influence is markedly present. This is particularly true of British poetry, which has relied on American poetry to relieve itself of the burden of its grand tradition since the 1860s. So who are some of the American poets whose work excites you?
Well, I think that there are many poets that excite me. A lot of them are my friends. I mean, the poetry community is quite small, and so I know a lot of them. A lot of us, our work has evolved over the years and our friendships have evolved. But I will go back to Allison's list. I know Allison, and I know that she is a widely read person, and I know she's probably read more poetry by Black poets than the average white person, I will say that. But her list is curious because I think, if I heard correctly, if you hear it, there are only white poets on that list. And that's interesting because, as I mentioned, Melvin Tolson, he was the great Black American poet writing in the long form, and no one reads him. No one reads him, and it's shocking to me. And he did so much for, not only did he do so much for African-American communities in his lifetime, but he did so much for American poetry. His poetry was so profound that another country asked him to be its poet laureate, over any of their other citizens. And his poem, Harlem Gallery, is a masterpiece of American poetry. And he, as I say, picking up his baton, he early on in his career said that he was going to go beyond what Eliot did. And I think he achieved it. I think he went far beyond Eliot, but because he wasn't white and because he wasn't taken up by many literary critics of his time, he was not seen as important. And when I was writing Circus, I was in an environment where if you knew anything about poetry, or if you wanted to prove that you knew anything about poetry, you had to contend with Eliot. And so I wanted to say, well, no, I actually don't have to contend with Eliot. I need to contend with my own ancestors, of whom Melvin Tolson is one. And if you hold The Wasteland, which is considered by most people to be the most important poem of the 20th century written in English, if you hold that up against Harlem Gallery, it pales in comparison, pun intended.
Thank you. I have a question here from David Ruckberg. Dante, to what extent has your move to London given or taken away from your writing?
I think it's given a lot to my writing because, very much like James Baldwin, you see your country so much more clearly when you live outside of it. And so that has allowed me to, I'm a poetry geek. And so I love poetry. I love reading poetry. I love talking about poetry. And I thought I loved American poetry before I moved here. And now I really love American poetry. And I see the enormousness of it in a way, especially compared to, again, British poetry, which is written in the same language. But yeah, the American influence on British poetry is immeasurable. And I think the same would have been said, so before Whitman and before Dickinson, the same could have been said about American poetry, that the British influence in American poetry was immeasurable. But after Leaves of Grass, that shifted. And after Eliot, that shifted. You know, British people like to claim Eliot, he won the Nobel Prize for Eliot, but what made him such a phenomenal poet was his Americanness. And like Whitman, he was a master of, you know, marketing this persona. He made himself into this sort of grand man of letters. But if you contrast the Anglo-Catholic with the you know, the son of a man in the candy business, you know, you see more of the latter in the poetry than you do the former, I think.
Understood. And speaking of influences, we have another question along that line. David Delaney asks, form and philosophy, how does form influence your poetry? And is there a particular philosopher or ideology that seems to run through your poems?
Well, one of the poets that excites me, the poet that excites me the most is the American poet Jay Wright, who is, you know, I think the best poet that America has ever produced. And he's still alive and he's still writing, and very few people read his work, which is unfortunate, you know, for them. But I think he deploys a sort of wide range of material in all of the poems that he composes. And as far as the philosophy is concerned, or philosopher is concerned, he is a deep reader of philosophy. And I also am a reader of philosophy. I couldn't say that there is one philosopher who really informs my own poems, but I could point maybe to another American poet, Carl Phillips, who I think is a philosopher. I think if you read Carl Phillips' poems, they are philosophies in their own right. And he talks about his main subject is desire, and I think that's really the center of all philosophy. No matter which philosopher you're talking about, there's a desire at the core of their thinking.
Interesting. Let's see. I think it's Tahani is asking, how important do you think editing is to the process of writing poetry?
Extremely, although I'm probably a bad example. I'm probably not the poet to ask about that, because I've said this many times before, and I really hope that I maintain this ability into my latter years, but I have a good memory. And so I compose poems in my head, and I retain lines and phrases for poems for years, it would seem. And so by the time I sit down to commit a poem to the page, it is basically done. It's edited, you know, it's been being mulled over in my head. And so one of my great friends, to whom Circus is dedicated, always used to be in awe of that. And I would always say to her, don't be in awe of that, because at any moment, you know, I could lose it, or as I get older, my memory might not be as good. And so I've taken to writing things down in notebooks, but that's not because I don't remember them. It's because I'm afraid that maybe I won't remember them. And therefore, if that does happen to me, I've got it written down somewhere. But for the most part, I work in my head. I work auditorily. I say the lines out to myself, and I say them over and over again. I compose the poem as it goes, and I keep it in my head. And then by the time I sit down to write it, it's mostly there. You know, I might have to punctuate it. But yeah, I think editing is incredibly important. When you've read your poem 100 times, you still probably have another 100 readings before you've made all the corrections that you intended to make.
I would agree with that. I'm jealous of your ability to do that in your head.
When I was composing Circus, I remember the second canto, which is quite long. It's, more than 100 lines. I was saying it over and over to myself, as mostly as it appears in the book. And another poet in another room, because I was working at a retreat, heard me and just stayed in the room. And then when I stopped, he came out and he said, wow, I didn't know you were so religious. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I heard you praying and I didn't want to come out and interrupt your praying. And I said, oh, I wasn't praying. I was just going over these lines in a poem.
That's wonderful. I have a comment from a fan of yours named Judy Winogrun.
Oh my goodness. Mrs. Winogrun was my third grade teacher.
She wants well, first of all, she's wanting an autographed copy of your books. And she says, Dante, I am more than proud. How did you choose this path?
Well, I've been writing poems since I was about 12, and Mrs. Winogrun would know, although nobody else I think listening would know. My 6th grade teacher was a woman named Joyce Vereen, and we had a writing assignment one day, and I still have it. It's somewhere here in the study. We had a writing assignment, just sort of a free write, as you do in 6th grade. And in the middle of my writing assignment, I started writing in quatrains. I'd never written a poem before. No one told me to write a poem that day. I just started writing these quatrains. So I think that can classify as my first poem. But anyway, I was writing those sort of preteen years and into my teenage years. And when I was 15 or 16, Sonia Sanchez came to read at the public library in Princeton, and a teacher at my school took me there. And that was the first time I'd seen a poet. And I didn't know that you could, I knew that there were poets in my reading books at school, but I didn't know that there were people who that's all they did was, be a poet. And she read and I was amazed. And at the end I got her book. I couldn't afford her book at the time. And she gave me a copy. Wow. And said, pay me back when you get the money. And she was absolutely incredible, because I was then, I went back to school. I was writing all these poems. I got up the courage to send her some poems, and she phoned my school maybe a year later and said, the poems are good, keep writing. And so that's what kept me writing poetry, but it wasn't going to be my path. I went to university to become a psychologist, and I met a teacher called Hetty Jones, and she got a poem of mine by mistake when I handed in an essay for one of her classes. And she called me into her office the following week and said, and she wrote on my poem that I did not mean to hand in, you're a poet. Why in the hell are you studying all this other bullshit? You need to become a poet. And she wanted me to give up my majors and just write poetry. I didn't do that. I finished and got my degree, but then I took her advice. She told me to go and audit a class with another poet named Marilyn Hacker. And I did that. And she said, take a class with Marilyn Hacker, she will teach you everything you need to know about poetry. And once you've learned that, ignore everything she said and write your own poems. So that's wonderful. That's how I got on the path, as it were.
Marilyn Hacker is incredible. Wow. Well, you've had some really stellar influences in your life.
Absolutely.
What a blessing to have teachers and people that encourage us, huh?
All women as well, they're just incredible.
Wonderful. Well, let's end with one last question, and then we'd love it if you'd end the gathering with a final poem. What's next for you? What other projects? I know you do have a class coming up at Writers and Books, and then do you have any other projects or writings in the works?
Yes, I'm currently under commission writing an opera libretto. And so the work is on the subject of the 13th century Sufi poet Rumi, about a period of time in his life. And so for the past 3 or so months, I have been rereading Rumi and working on this libretto, and that has been really exciting. And I'm always, I inherited a practice from my literary mentor, Yusuf Komunyakaa. I had the great privilege of being his literary assistant for some years, and then formally being his graduate student. And one of the great things about Yusuf is that he works on multiple projects at the same time. And so besides the opera, I've got about 4 different books work simmering, I would say. 3 of them are book-length poems, and the other is a sort of more traditional collection of poems. And I just write them as they come. Whichever one gets done first will be the one that gets shipped off to the publisher.
So you sort of switch lanes and...
Yeah, it depends on how I'm feeling in the day. Sometimes I'll get up and I'll work on the opera, because there's a deadline for that actually coming up very soon. So I'll probably be working on that next week. But you know, once I've submitted the draft of the opera, until the composer comes back to me, I'll get up one day and I might be in the mood for one project or the other, and that's how I work.
Wonderful. Well, we'd love it if you'd end our gathering today with a final reading of a poem. Sure.
Before the pandemic, the word corona meant, at least for poets, it was a poetic term. It meant a crown of sonnets. And there's a very, very old tradition of creating this form of poem. And so this is my latest one, and it's entitled Corona. Starlings, after a mild winter, return to post, a modest house in a curve of road. Days into their speckle, their light load. I am fair witness, almost. How far they come, from whichever roost. Remember walking away from where the river flowed, that murmuration the starlings made and owed. Not to the sky, but nature itself, to boast. I spoke to my neighbor across the fence, kept my distance, he could not name the bird. Near where I live, a hospital of tents. I asked my neighbor if he had heard. Hearing things that made no sense, the answer, as expected, not a word. Not a word on a usually busy street. Mosquitoes wake to find there is no human meat. Something about the immunity of a herd. If signs come in threes, this was the third. Nature, true to form, retaliates with heat. There are no people outside to greet. Any attempt to escape deferred. I spoke with friends with wireless fidelity. Zoom in on baby faces laughing, unlike our callousness toward catastrophe. Better that than politicians lying. Breach the week's cooking with vitality. Master my mastery of loafing. Master my mastery of loafing. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. A generation found its civic lessons dispensable. Inequality, the tie that binds the living. A steward named us suicidal species, unlike the bird with its singing. Perhaps the signs are not discernible. Recidivist behavior is despicable. I spoke to my family who, of course, had misgivings, forecast to flourish in the next season. Think of all the dinner parties to host. Be ashamed to think such treason. One may as well blaspheme the Holy Ghost. Then again, there is hope in reason. The starlings, after all, return to post.
Oh, what a brilliant ending. My goodness. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante. That was really great. Thank you so much.
I've noticed that there might be some more questions, so I know that we've run out of time, but if you will send them to me, I'm happy to respond to them if you will. I don't know how you get it to the audience, but yeah.
Super.
Sure, yeah. We can, if you email us and we'll get it to you.
Great.
I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to Celeste. Thank you to Quelly for co-sponsoring. And I say take Dante's workshop, it's next Saturday, and buy his book. And I want to thank everyone and have a great weekend.
Ampersand Books.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dante. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Celeste.